Welcome to episode 45 of Mitolife Radio. I'm your host, Matt Blackburn, and today I'm speaking with Mr. Ben Belty for the second time. He is really fascinating to speak with about foraging, hunting, rewilding, just a wealth of knowledge about plant identification and how to utilize them. He talks about a great wild plant to use in a tea called fireweed. We talk about the carnivore diet and even aspirin in an ancestral nutrition sense, when we used to get aspirin compounds in our diet that we're actually missing now. I've been experiencing impressive benefits from supplementing aspirin, usually 1 to 2 grams a day, and I actually dissolve it in hot water. I'll drop in non-Bayer, I use Jericare brand aspirin, and they are 275 milligram tablets, and I do 3 minimum in a 16 ounce mason jar, and then I put in hot water and I'll let it sit, stir it up a little bit, let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes until it gets lukewarm, and then I drink it, and it's like an aspirin tea. And I'm not getting any of the cornstarch, which is the excipient that they use in the Jericare aspirin. So just stay away from the Bayer one because they use a lot of really toxic compounds as excipients in that one. Plus, it's not the most ethical company. So I think you guys will really enjoy this and get a lot out of it, a lot of practical information that you can take with you. Enjoy. All right, Ben Belty, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Matt. I'm glad to be back on. I think we got some good stuff to talk about today.
Definitely. Yeah, in the last show, I interviewed John Moody for the second time, and he was saying you guys are in the same neck of the woods, and he remembers going out into the wilderness with you, and he could tell that you were seeing things that he wasn't seeing, and I thought that was a pretty cool little description, because that's how it is, right? When you're outside, most people just see trees, landscape, they don't really pay attention to the detail.
Yeah, the wall of green is what most people see, and I've sort of been spending the last 10 years figuring out all the different things that make up the wall of green: food, medicine, and all different kinds of things.
I love it. Yeah, I recently, as you know, moved from Southern California up to North Idaho, and it's pretty close to Canada. And so you have a lot, much different fauna and flora than you do down in SoCal. And especially the fungi, it's been really fun to learn about. And there's all this scare stuff about mushrooms, right? Because there was that movie Into the Wild, and I guess the book, and he ate a wild plant and died or whatever. But when you're talking about tree mushrooms, especially like on birch trees, like birch polypores, a lot of these are really easy to identify, right?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. There's no known poisonous polypore mushrooms. There are definitely some that don't taste very good, but none that are gonna put you in the ground. Yeah, mushrooms are one of those things that people are just so afraid of because there's just a big culture of fear around them. But they're also something that human beings have been eating for quite a long time and using for medicine and even fire carrying. The birch polypore specifically was used by various different people over the centuries to actually carry a coal. You can take a coal out of a fire, put it inside of a birch polypore mushroom, and then wrap it up and even carry it inside of a pouch and tend and keep the coal to your next campsite. So that's pretty cool. I've actually done that before. And the birch polypore mushroom has this quality where it sort of just smolders, like it kind of burns, but it doesn't really catch on fire. So you can use it to carry a hot coal and start a fire with it for several hours. I'm not sure the exact time frame on it, but it's just kind of a cool thing. cool fact about mushrooms. And there's other mushrooms you can do it with as well. But as many people know that are probably listening to this show, mushrooms obviously have some medicinal properties as well. It's one mushroom that I have not really worked with medicinally that much, unfortunately. The one that I have the most experience with is chaga. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that mushroom, or it's actually not a mushroom. It's a more of like a fungal growth that essentially concentrates the uh, the betulinic acid and the essentially the essence or the life force of the entire birch tree. There is a lot of uh, myths and thoughts and theories about chaga. Um, One important thing though is that it needs to come from live trees if you're harvesting it yourself. So that's something to keep in mind for someone wanting to go out and um, find chaga on their own. One thing you can look for on it is to make sure that the tree, if it's the wintertime, the tree has buds on it, like for next year's growth. Or in the summertime, make sure that the chaga actually has leaves growing on it. If it doesn't have any leaves, then it's probably a dead tree, and the chaga is no good anymore, unfortunately. Do you have a lot of birch trees up there where you're at, Matt?
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'd love to dive into more of those myths. Yeah, I'm actually seeing them out the window of my office right now. It's one of the most predominant trees. There's also tamarack and different types of pine trees. So it's a really cool environment.
Yeah, tamarack's a really cool tree. We unfortunately don't have any of that really in Kentucky. There's like a few ornamentals, but nothing serious. That's a large tree, and you can actually harvest some nice, tasty resin off of those trees.
Oh, that's good to know. That's really cool. And yeah, I want to dive more into chaga. And it's funny. I think you might have seen my recent foraging with chaga, and I think it's pretty common mistake to mistake it for a burl, right? Like a birch burl, which is it almost looks like chaga, but it's more part of the tree and it's more rounded, right? And that's a common mistake people make.
Yeah, I mean, you if you're in any foraging Facebook group, you'll see like 10 posts like every year that are like, "Is this chaga? Is this chaga?" And it's like all these different types of tree burls that people post, and it's like it looks kind of close, but there's just some telltale signs of chaga that you sort of know that it's chaga. Um, one being the like really deep sort of yellow golden color. If you break one of the black chunks off, and then there's obviously that really dark kind of charred looking skin that's on the outside of the chaga, um, which is actually where a lot of the medicine is. But also, as I saw you recently post, is if you don't really have any serious health issues going on, you don't necessarily need all of that black um, parts of the fungus in your teas and things. It can be a little bit bitter, and I find it can be a little bit astringent and kind of drying if you don't balance it out with some other stuff. So it's certainly considered a tonic, but I do find it can be a little bit drying on the tissues sometimes, which can be good depending on what you've got going on. But for more of a tonic beverage, I'd say chop that off, save it, tincture it, maybe do some more medicinal things with it, and then the inside is what you can use um, for the more of a mild tasting tea.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's my understanding that the outer layer is more concentrated in the betulin and betulinic acid and the terpenes, and the inside is more of the long chain sugars, right?
Yeah, the beta glucans, yeah, like the sort of the immune modulating um, compounds rather than the more medicinal sort of I guess I don't want to say like the more defensive compounds, I guess, or where you're going to find it in the black uh, parts of the fungus. In Russia, they actually make a pharmaceutical out of chaga. And it's essentially like pure betulinic acid, and they use it for all kinds of stuff, mostly like cancers and things like that. And apparently, it's pretty effective. I've never needed to seek it out or anything, but there's tons of research online about it pretty interesting. You have to use Google Translate, which can be kind of weird sometimes because the translations are not really that great. But you can get a lot of information out of the out of those documents if you Google them. You can sometimes find some really cool stuff on Chaga specifically. But you know, the Russians have done a lot of research on Chaga specifically, but then you have there's tons of Chinese research on other medicinal mushrooms, reishi, lion's mane, the agaricus mushrooms, the turkey tail mushroom. I mean, there's just so many different mushrooms out there that are edible. The the number that are poisonous to us, um, in my opinion, is relatively small compared to the amount that are edible to us. So um, that's something to consider when you're out identifying mushrooms. Is you do want to take back samples of different mushrooms that you find, analyze their qualities, get some field guides to identify characteristics of the mushrooms because, well, I don't really want people to operate with fear when they're harvesting wild stuff, mushrooms, plants, and everything. I also want people to be absolutely sure of what they are consuming. Small tastes of things aren't going to kill you, but if you eat a large amount of something that's really poisonous, it can be, obviously uh, not not a good experience, to say the least.
I've heard before that tree mushrooms, I forget this if it was 99% are completely safe, but it's really the ground mushrooms, like the what's that red and white one? Like that one, that one's really
Yeah, the
poisonous, right?
amanitas.
Yeah.
Yeah, the amanita. Yep,
Is that
and
generally
those do
true that the
occur.
ones in the ground? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, yeah. Usually, I mean, obviously, there's plenty of mushrooms that grow on the in the soil on the ground that aren't poisonous. Chanterelles being a one that most people would recognize. But yeah, mushroom on wood is generally considered to be safe for consumption. Now, whether or not you want to eat all mushrooms you find on wood is a different story. There's some that are just so bitter that no one wants to eat them, and also a lot of them are so tough that you can't really eat them. You can certainly make teas out of them, but again, like I said, they're so bitter because they've concentrated a lot of those different compounds in the tree that sort of make it to where you don't want to eat it. A good example is one of the Ganodermas. Can't remember exactly which one, but it grows on, like, I think it's locust trees, and those are known to be very rot and insect resistant. Reason being is the plant produces so many chemicals that keep the bugs away that when the mushroom grows on the plant, it's going to concentrate all those different insecticidal compounds that are in the wood. Um, like I said, those can have beneficial effects, but the taste is like beyond what most people are willing to experience. But for specific illnesses and things like that, stuff like that can be um, a good thing to have in the toolbox of herbal medicine.
Awesome. And how do you consume chaga? Because I've been kind of doing maple syrup, shilajit, heavy cream, a little bit of MCT oil, kind of the usual elixir blend, and it's delicious. But I think even if someone were to add honey or maple syrup to their chaga tea, that's really all you need.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's pretty much exactly how I drink it most of the time. Some raw milk, some cream, a little bit of butter, obviously maple syrup for sure. Maple sugar is really what I've been digging lately. Honey is great. You can put in some other herbs in there too. Like I like to mix roasted dandelion root in there is really nice. It makes kind of like a coffee sort of latte kind of taste, gives that little bit of like an espresso bitter to it. Um, Mixing other things in there. There's another herb that I've been consuming a lot lately that I also mix with my chaga. It's known as fireweed, or Ivan Chai is um, the Russian sort of name for it. Um, it's a plant that grows in the northern, you know, areas of the planet in like the boreal forest. You'll probably end up finding some up there next season. Look it up. It's a great tea. I buy it because I don't have access to it here where I live. It doesn't grow wild here because it's too the the latitude is too I'm too close to the equator here, so I don't find it here. But so I buy it, and it's the stuff that I buy is actually fermented and it's from Siberia. So yes, it's an imported thing, but at the same time, I can trust that there's not been any kind of chemicals or anything like that sprayed on it. Whereas when you go foraging here on roadsides, you kind of never know what you're going to get. Um, in the United States, it's like every time I drive somewhere in the summertime, if I'm on a country road or something, I see a truck that's just like spraying um, unlimited amounts of Roundup on the sides of the road. So, anyways, the fireweed tea, I love. What I'll do is I'll take the fireweed tea, I'll brew that, and then I'll either add chaga tea that I've already made, or if I have like chaga extract powder, I'll mix that in there. And I find that those two herbs are just really good. They have that dark quality. They're very like tonifying to the internal tissues, energizing, good for the liver, good for the immune system. They help keep your body warm. Um, Another interesting thing about the fireweed is it does have some like analgesic, very, very mild analgesic properties because it does have some of the aspirin like compounds in it, like a lot of other wild plants do. So, those are some ways that I've been consuming my chaga lately. It's really great, great way to start the day.
That's awesome. After a good breakfast, right?
Yeah, exactly. Lately it's funny because what I'll do is I'll like maybe just have like a little bit of a hot drink just to kind of get things moving, but I don't really drink a whole lot of liquids before I eat. So what I'll do is I'll eat my big breakfast and then I'll have I'll maybe drink my elixir drink with my breakfast or like shortly after my breakfast, and that sort of helps it, helps the food digest, and it also um, keeps me from like getting kind of wired. Like I find if I take a lot of herbs, any kind of herbs, even if I drink coffee, because technically coffee's an herb, if I take that stuff on an empty stomach, I just realize it's really like it can be really hard on the system. And I don't know if it's just because I'm a little bit older than when I first started taking elixirs and stuff, or if it's just how it's always been. But I've noticed that when I take a lot of herbs and stuff, if I'm not getting enough food, the way they affect me is totally different than if I'm like eating regularly and my metabolism is good and all that stuff. So I definitely recommend people consider eating more food with their elixirs, contrary to popular belief.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know that you're in the same kind of community, repeat metabolism, and yeah, if you're not waking up hungry, that definitely is an issue. I think you and I have both been there. The whole keto thing.
Yes, starvation 101. Still recovering, but definitely making a lot of progress over the past few years.
Yeah, yeah, same here over the last year, and it's cool. I looked up fireweed, and that's a beautiful plant. It looks like there's big pink flowers, and it seems like that would be fairly easy to identify once you uh, can identify the petals and everything, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's very easy to identify, especially when it's in flower. The whole plant's edible, um, and obviously medicinal. I don't really see any reason to necessarily eat the leaves. I mean, the really young shoots are good. You can eat. I've heard of people eating them because they're sort of tender, like a vegetable, like a sprouted vegetable kind of thing. But once they grow up and they get the seed heads on, or the seed heads and the flowers, at that point you don't really want to think about eating it. You want to think about harvesting it, drying it, and making teas out of it. The way I've done it is when I have been able to harvest it myself is I basically just cut the plant off at the stalk, hang it up for a few days or put it out in the sun to dry, and then I just sort of just hold the stem and just pull all the leaves and the flowers and everything off and put it into a jar. Like I said, I also buy it when I can't get it, when I can't harvest it. And when you buy it, you can get it on Amazon. We can probably put a link to it um, in the show notes or whatever. But when you buy it on Amazon, you get this really nice fermented these pellets. They look like little pellets. I mean, I don't want to say it, but it kind of looks like rabbit food. But it has this like almost like pu'er tea kind of feel to it. Um, it's not as stimulating necessarily as pu'er because it doesn't have caffeine, but it does have that really nice, rich sort of like um, nutritive quality that you get from a good pu'er. I don't know if you've ever had any like really good pu'ers before, but it sort of just has that feel to it, that body. Another cool thing about the plant is it's very low in anti-nutrients. So there's little to no oxalic acid. There's no like what's the anti-nutrient, the stuff that's in grains, and some vegetables have it too. Phytic acid. Yeah, I
phytate.
don't know why I couldn't think of that. Yeah, phytic acid. Yeah, phytates. It doesn't have any of those. It does have a little bit of tannins, which can be considered an anti-nutrient, but also a little bit of tannins in your diet is actually good. It can help keep the digestive system clean. It's good for your mouth. It keeps like a lot of the like dead skin and plaque and stuff. Helps get some of that stuff off your teeth. Keeps your tongue clean. It's really good for oral health. It's sort of just like an overall like internal cleanser of the body, but not in like a green juice kind of way. More in like a mild antimicrobial kind of way, rather than like a like a flush things out. It's more of like a nourish and restore rather than like a you know a deficiency creating thing like you would get with the green juice. It's also like it has a lot of minerals and calcium and things like that that really help support the overall health of your body and your digestive system. So definitely recommend people check out that herb. It's like it should be the new tonic herb in my opinion.
I love it. That's really interesting. And I'm glad that you brought up anti nutrients because we both see the carnivore diet trending, and I know you're watching that, and it's interesting. I have friends that are doing it, and I think they mean well, and there's something to that. I mean, especially with the state of modern agriculture and NPK, even organic, it's just horrible for you, especially juicing. But their argument is that plants have indigestible fiber and anti nutrients, therefore don't eat plants. But are, are you kind of in the same mindset where I think like eat mostly animal products and then some plants, and that's like very, very balanced?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of where I'm at. I think that the complete like swearing off of all plants is really not. It's really counter to being human and consuming a natural human diet. Sure, there were times when uh, ancient people would have had access to almost no plants, but the fact of the matter is people have been harvesting, drying, storing, processing plants for pretty much forever, as long as we've been a species, and even before we were, human Homo sapiens. So, sort of where I'm at with all that is, um, I eat less domesticated plants. I try to stick to plants that are like earlier in their growing cycle, and the ones that I am going to consume that are later in their growing cycle, I'm going to want to try to trim off the more uh, densely fibrous things. Like if I'm going to eat some like late season kale and it has big stems on it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim off all those stems, and then I'm going to take the kale and I'm going to blanch it for a few minutes, and then I'm going to cook it, with some kind of meat or some kind of fat to help sort of break down and absorb some of the minerals and vitamins in there into the fat and sort of can make them more digestible to the body. And then I'm going to take those stems and I'm just going to throw them away because they're not really worth anything. They're just fiber, and it's just not something I'm going to be able to digest. But the more tender greens and things like that, while they do have some fiber in it, it's not as rigid and it's not as tough and harsh on the digestive system. I mean, you bite into some of the kale and things like that you buy at the grocery store, and it's like so fibrous. It's like eating like a sponge or like a ball of hair or something. I just don't understand why people like to eat that, but that's just what people think is healthy, so that's what they do. Um, things like nettle greens, and you're starting to be able to see these available at even basic grocery stores are starting to sell things like this. They go for things like dandelion greens, and sometimes people say that dandelion greens are too bitter for them, which I can understand. A lot of people aren't used to those flavors, but if you want to sort of cut some of that down, all you got to do is just blanch the vegetables. If they have a little bit too strong of a flavor, just blanch them real quick. You can toss the water or drink it because it sometimes is going to contain some calcium and things like that. And then just saute it with something flavorful, some kind of sauce, a little bone broth, some cheese, some milk, some cream, something like that to kind of give it some flavor and sort of cut some of that um, bitterness down. I'd say the one of the best vegetables to avoid is any kind of lettuce, unless you're buying it at a farmer's market and the farmer's not using any kind of synthetic fertilizers. Lettuce is just one of those things just sort of off the table. Kale is another thing. Like I said, I eat it sometimes, but when I do eat it, I try to buy it from a farmer that's using organic fertilizer and not this like synthetic, World War II stuff that most large scale organic farms are using now. So I don't know where are you at with the whole vegetable thing?
Yeah, I agree completely with everything you just said. I was into dandelion greens, I think like 3 or 4 years ago when I was just kind of learning about like rewilding and stuff, and I was mixing that with bison and having that with butter, basically dandelion greens, butter, and bison. That was awesome. But yeah, I fully agree. I think there's compounds in the vegetables that are really, really important. Like campferol, I think that's in leeks, is really, really good. And I do a lot of Dr. Cowan's powders just because it's easy and I might be lazy, but they do the blanching and all the steaming and make it low. Like you even have a low oxalate greens blend, and so I'll just take scoops of that and put that on my ground meat, and then throw some of your wild rice in there, throw some butter in, some sea salt, and have a complete meal, and it's really delicious.
Yeah, that's a good way to go. I have not tried those powders. I want to try them. Maybe I'll get on that this week. I've always seen you posting about them, and they've seemed interesting. And it's actually kind of a cool way to get vegetables in because they're sort of pre-processed for you and they're ready to go. And um, that's another way that I choose to consume plants is in the form of dried, um, leafy material or flowers or roots or things like that. Is through teas, drying these different plants and their parts and consuming them as teas is not only beneficial for medicinally speaking for various health conditions that we experience during different parts of the year, but you're still getting some amount of nutrients, B vitamins and sort of basic stuff like that when you consume plants, in the form of teas, especially things like oat straw, nettle, um, chicory root, dandelion root, chickweed, red clover, um, all those different kinds of herbs that end up containing a lot of different kinds of minerals and things that we certainly can get from animal foods, but they come in different forms in plants that I think can be beneficial to us if we're balancing them out with animal products too. That said, I don't think that trying to survive on plant foods that aren't root vegetables, high quality organic grains, or sweet ripe fruits is probably a good way to go. I see a lot of people trying to survive on greens and things like that. I just don't think that that's a good long term strategy unless you're trying to survive for one reason or another.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm glad you brought up root vegetables. I think you've seen my potato posts. I'm a big fan of throwing, 4, 5, 6 potatoes. I like white potatoes and baking them in the convection oven. It's so easy. And then the hardest part is just peeling them. I just use a knife and a spoon, peel off the skins, and then toss a ton of butter in there, some sea salt, and that's maybe some Dr. Cowan's powders, greens, and so satiating. And I feel like a strengthening effect from the potatoes. I don't know. I've never seen definitive stuff on the keto acids, that combine with ammonia and make the essential amino acids, but I feel that viscerally. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, potatoes are a really good source of food if they're organic and grown in a manner that essentially supports the health of the plant, um, good soil, and all those kinds of things. It's been around. The potato has been around for quite a long time, several thousand years. I believe that they were developed in the high Andes, and then sort of bred out from there for all the different varieties that we see today. But you know, millions or billions of people um, use potatoes as a staple in their diet. So to try to demonize something that's uh, supporting the metabolism of a large population of the earth is kind of strange to me. But people have convenience now, and they're allowed to demonize certain different uh, food groups because they have the ability to go to Costco and buy like 50 pounds of ribeye if they want. you know, which is not necessarily something that's always been possible.
That's a great point. Yeah, it's really easy to get on the carnivore diet. Just go to Costco and load up on the ribeyes.
Yeah, that's another thing that really gets me is like, I understand. I think people should buy the best quality animal products they can afford at the time. But I see a lot of things in this carnivore community that's actually getting pretty big now to where you just you shouldn't care and you should never care and you shouldn't even try to support better um, qualities of meat because you can't afford them and you'll never be able to afford them. But I think the fact is if more people um, started buying them, even if all you can afford is to buy 2 pounds of grass-fed beef a week, over time the market will shift and will be more, um, you know, forgiving and more plentiful in the higher quality meats over the lower quality, you know, CAFO fed animals that people are subsisting on. Now, I'm sure John Moody probably touched on some of the issues with meat now and how foreign meats can be brought in and sold as origin unknown or country of origin not even on the package, so people don't really know what they're getting. Um, but at the end of the day, if more people bought local, there'd be more local food available. More people probably also need to think about becoming farmers and things like that. But unfortunately, it's sort of a lost and a dying art that's seeing a renaissance. But who knows if it's gonna last through all the vegan propaganda that we have going on now.
Yeah, well said. And even with grass fed beef, like there's levels, right? Because you can have grass fed beef, but if they're eating dead yellow grass that's barely alive, then the meat's not going to be as nutritious and the cows are going to be more stressed because they have to eat more frequently, right? Like all day long versus, like Salatin that as a grass farmer, he's making this incredible grass. The cows don't have to eat all day long, right? So their stress is lower, so they get less disease.
Yeah, well, I will say one thing. When I worked for a farm, the bison farm that I used to work for, we also owned a slaughterhouse where the bison were processed. Just a small, family operation, and I noticed that the the grass fed animals, be it bison or beef or lamb, the grass fed animals that they would bring in when they were slaughtered and dressed and broken down, the carcasses and like the viscera of the animals would have almost no smell. It would just smell like meat. Um, but they would bring these cows in from other farmers that were like just fattened on nothing but grain for the last however many weeks of their life. And these animals come in and they're sick. They're like you know defecating grain all over the place. And when they would take these animals in, they would when they would slaughter these animals and they would cut them open, it was just a very, very unpleasant smell that you would get. It was always it was always the grain finished animals that had this really, kind of nasty smell to them. But the grass fed animals almost never had that smell. So I talked to a few farmers over a period of time, and sort of asked them like the different farmers, like, oh, are you grass fed? Are you grain fed? And the grain fed ones a lot of times would say how they would have to feed their animals like pallets of baking soda to keep them from getting sick because they were pumping them full of so much grain. Their bodies couldn't handle it. They were becoming too acidic from all the grain. Whereas the grass-fed animals, the grass-fed beef farmers almost never had a problem with that. And if they did, they wouldn't slaughter the animals. They would pull them out. They would get them healthy again, and then they would take them back. So it was just kind of interesting to see like the mindset of the farmers that were finishing on grass was oftentimes like way more holistic and way more about providing a good product, whereas the grain finishers were like, sort of just we want to make as much money as we possibly can and move on with it. So it was just interesting to see that whole process. And then also, to me, it seems pointless to fatten animals on corn because they get so fat, most of the fat ends up getting thrown away anyways, or used for other things. The grass-fed animals require almost no trimming; they just have the perfect amount of fat on them, and the taste, in my opinion, is much better. One thing that I hear people say a lot is that they don't like the taste of grass-fed beef, and what I think they mean is they actually like beef with no flavor. And when they get a steak that has flavor, they're not used to it. So they say that they would rather have a corn-fed steak, which to me like has almost no flavor, where a grass-fed steak is like tons of flavor. You can taste what the animals were eating, before they were, before they were processed. So it's kind of interesting to see, people's takes on different kinds of meat. Overall, I would say people need to buy grass-fed beef that's finished on grass, and it needs to be local. I understand that's not possible for everyone, and some good alternatives are a lot of the grass-fed beef that's sold in the United States at bigger chain stores, Kroger, Trader Joe's, things like that. Unfortunately, is imported from Australia, South America. Mostly, I think it's either Paraguay or Uruguay where a lot of grass-fed beef comes from in South America, not Brazil, unlike what a lot of people say. Um, those countries actually have pretty good programs for their beef. They have good standards. They want to produce a good product. They don't want to produce low quality um, products. And they also have oh, sorry, I lost a thought there. They don't have the problems that we have in our country with Roundup and genetically modified feeds like alfalfa and things like that. A lot of those countries that are exporting their beef to the United States that it's grass fed, they don't uh, have all the chemicals in the contaminating the meat like we do. So that's just a couple things for people to think about when they're shopping for their grass fed beef.
Those are really, really great points. And yeah, I've learned the hard way buying from different sources, and I can really feel the difference. So I prefer to pay a premium and get the best, even if it's $8 a pound, which to me is very affordable. And I feel awesome from it. I was wondering, Ben, have you gotten into hunting? Because that's kind of my next adventure that I'm interested in learning how to hunt deer and stuff like that. I was wondering how far you've gone down the hunting rabbit hole.
Yeah, I have started hunting. I will say I have not been very successful yet. I went out last year and with a friend of mine, and we tracked some deer, and we were close, but we didn't end up getting anything. This year, I'm gonna go out again for deer. I'd really like to go out west and do an elk hunt sometime because I understand they're pretty prolific out there, and the rate of success is pretty high. We do have a lot of white-tailed deer here, but there's like a lot of diseases that they're starting to get, which it's not pushing me away, but it's just making me wonder, how much longer are we going to be able to hunt in civilization? You know what I mean? Like there's so many diseases that are getting spread around by from domesticated livestock and different things that it just you know it just makes me wonder like what the future is going to hold for hunting, especially.
That's really sad. Yeah, like Lyme disease, you can get that from eating contaminated deer, right? That has Lyme.
Um, I'm not sure about Lyme disease, but there's a disease called chronic wasting disease, and it hasn't moved into the area where I live yet, I don't believe, but it's really bad in the Midwest, and I think it's like analogous to like mad cow disease, and I think it can be spread to humans. Um, and I don't know exactly what it does, but it's like one of those things where at the very least, it's very alarming to just hear about it. It's one of those things. It's like they really don't know how to stop it, except for um, a lot of states now are banning like feeding um, animals. Like a lot of hunters will like put out corn and things like that to bait the animals in to make it easier to hunt them. I think a lot of states are starting to ban that practice because it spreads. I guess it makes it easier for the disease to spread. It's kind of a vector for the disease because multiple different animals will congregate in that area and sort of share food. And if one of them has the disease, then all of them can end up, and then they'll move into other areas um, and spread the disease. I think in Indiana, where I live, in Kentucky, sort of two states that border each other where I'm at, and I hunt in both of them. I believe both of those states have outlawed baiting, but I'm not completely certain on that. Though the charts show that neither state has chronic wasting disease, and it's due to the fact that baiting is not standard practice here. So it's just one of those things to think about when you're getting into hunting. Like there's risk with anything you do in life, so I don't think it's something that should hold anyone back from hunting. It's just something you got to kind of think about. Have you managed to see any elk out your way yet?
Not yet, but I had a local person show me a video they took of a moose, and I guess the moose are more dangerous than most of the other animals because I guess they can just trample you. And it looked really big, and I guess those are often sighted in the city. Funny enough, and not as often in the wilderness, but you'll actually see them in parking lots and stuff. I haven't yet, but I guess that's the moose you really have to look out for as far as aggression, which I found fascinating. I was looking out for bears, right, especially like grizzlies.
Yeah. Do they have? Is there grizzlies out there in Idaho?
There are, yeah, they're definitely way up north. Mostly black bears, but there's definitely grizzlies here.
Yeah, that's great. Black bear is really good stuff. I love black bear. I have not hunted a black bear myself. I have a friend that just went uh, and harvested a black bear not long ago. That's cool that you have black bears there. You should definitely look into the black bear hunt. You can get a lot of meat and some really good fat off of those animals, especially if they're animals that are living sort of in the wilderness away from the cities. The moose thing is cool. I don't know what the regulations are like with moose up there, but other places that have moose, it's like a lottery where you essentially you pay a fee and your name gets added into a drawing. Every year they pull a certain number of names out of the drawing, and then you get awarded a moose tag, and you get to go out and hunt a moose. And I think it builds like over time as you continue to add your name to the pot. Every year you get more points towards winning, and then eventually it's guaranteed that in a lifetime, as long as you stay at it, you'll get a moose tag. But it's also sort of viewed as something that's like a once in a lifetime experience, to actually be able to go out and hunt a moose. So a lot of people like hired guides and things like that. So one of the interesting things about eating hunted meat for me is the aspect of the animals eating wild foods and concentrating them in their tissues. Obviously fats. Animals eating acorns and then concentrating those fats inside their tissues. And then another interesting thing is, and this is like totally like conjecture. This is like a hypothesis that I have. I have no data to back this up. It's just something to think about, and I've been thinking about it for a while. And essentially, my theory is that one of the reasons why aspirin is such an effective medicine for humans is because we've been consuming aspirin-like compounds for a long time in the form of animal flesh and blood. A lot of animals, especially moose and many other herbivores that have been hunted by humans, eat lots of willow. So willow is a plant that some people might know, like white willow bark is like used as like an aspirin substitute, like an herbal aspirin substitute. But the active chemical in aspirin is actually named after genus Salicin, or Salix, which is the genus name of the species name of the willow plant. So willow plants grow pretty much all over the northern hemisphere at varying latitudes, all the way up to the Arctic, all the way down to more southern latitudes. And it's a very popular browse food among many different species of animals, to the point where animals can like consume entire trees, entire like hedgerows of willow. Any given browsing animal will eat deer, moose, reindeer, elk, sheep, goats. Any of those animals will consume willow in really large quantities because I think it has like a lot of digestible like sugars and things in the bark, so the animals really like to chew on and eat it. But what they're doing when they're eating this stuff is they're concentrating all these aspirin-like compounds in their tissues, because it's known that the salicylates can actually build up in the body, and it's also in their blood. And blood is a thing that humans have really gotten away from eating, but in other countries, even to this day, there's still a lot of things like blood puddings and sausages and foods that are made with blood. So when humans in the past, even the recent past, would harvest an animal, be it by slaughtering on a farm or hunting in the wild, would save and consume most of the animal, including the blood. So given that the animals are consuming all of this willow, a lot of the compounds from the willow are going to end up in this animal's bloodstream. And when we eat the blood and the tissues of the animals, we're going to be getting this compound in our body. Nowadays, the animals that we eat do not contain the same plants. They're not eating the same plants that the animals that we used to eat ate, if that makes sense. So I just have this theory that aspirin is more like a supplement than an actual like pharmaceutical drug. I mean, obviously it is a pharmaceutical drug because it's made in a lab somewhere, but it's more of like a replacement for a nutrient that we're missing in our diet because we're not eating our traditional diet, which is wild foods. I mean, that's what humans ate until a few thousand years ago when, human beings domesticated themselves and became farmers, which, take it or leave it, that's where we're at. We have to farm now, but we can also replicate some of the past by hunting and foraging and doing all these things as well to sort of supplement the agrarian lifestyle that we've also found ourselves in as well. So that's just sort of an interesting thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately because um, you know, we used to hunt a lot more. Like everyone used to eat hunted meat until even 50 years ago. Like so many people used to eat hunted meat. It was like normal. And now it's like if you hunt, you're an outsider. Fortunately, it's starting to come back, but um, it's also one of those things that even the vegans are going after the hunters now. Like I remember when I was vegan, like I was on the fence about hunting. It seemed like, yeah, I could see, reasons for both sides, and obviously we know what path I decided to go down. But many of the vegan friends that I had even were totally fine with hunting. They understood the ethics behind it. But now it's like all out war on anyone that wants to hunt or husband animals or anything. So just kind of interesting times that we're finding ourselves in now.
Yeah, those were really awesome points. That's definitely something for me to think about. Eating domesticated versus wild game and getting those compounds. That's really, really fascinating. And looking at aspirin as more of a supplement. I
Well,
mean, it's something that I feel. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and like, yes, hunting is great, and eating wild meat is awesome. But at the same time, like we have animals that are very domesticated, like sheep, for example. But you can like manage and herd sheep, you know, in like a wild environment where they're browsing and eating birch trees and willow and all these different like broadleaf plants that are not just basic grasses and things like that. So it's possible to sort of recreate some of this stuff and sort of you know reverse engineer wild environments with domesticated animals.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so put some willow trees in if you're a farmer. That's really cool.
Exactly. Yeah. Have some sheep and let them eat. Let them eat what they want to eat.
I love it. Yeah, I feel aspirin every single time I take it. I'm averaging about 2 grams, maybe 3 grams a day, and I feel awesome from it. I mean, I know growing up for maybe 25 years of my life, I was eating domesticated animals, and I didn't have bison, until very recently.
Yeah. Aspirin's one of those things that like I didn't take pharmaceuticals for I don't know at least 10 years or more, and I just started reading about aspirin, and I'm like, okay, I obviously have a bias against pharmaceuticals, but like let's just see what the research has to say. So I started reading, and I'm reading Ray P stuff, and I'm reading some different things, and I'm just sort of making all these connections and thinking about like, okay, well, I'm the kind of person that it's like if I can't somehow make it myself, then I don't really want to buy it. So I was like, okay, well, I guess I could take willow bark tea or bark powder or whatever, but the amount that you have to take is pretty significant to combat the amount of inflammation that most people have these days. So I started thinking, and I'm like, well, I guess I'll experiment with it. And then I like came to the realization. I think it may have even been you that said it. It's like the medical model that we have now is not going to suggest that people take something that costs $3 for a month's supply. So it only makes sense that aspirin's been demonized by the pharmaceutical companies because it's so cheap for them to produce. They're not making any money on it. So I sort of just came to this realization that like there's really no harm in it. It's very inexpensive. It has very few side effects, and the side effects that it does have um, can be remedied with various different things that you've sort of touched on in different posts and things on the internet. So to me, it's like, yeah, it's produced by industry, which I want to move away from, but at the same time, it's like I live in industry, so I sort of have to find a happy medium there between like living how I want to live and living what's practical for me to live in the moment that I'm in right now.
That's well said. Yeah, and that's kind of how I view supplementing vitamin E, which I'm sure you've looked into because it's similar effects of aspirin. And I just think, okay, I've lived almost my entire life on a PUFA diet, and my parents did my best, and even when I was into health, I was eating even more PUFAs than I did growing up. And so, just like the salicylic acid, it's concentrating in your tissues, and so it's almost like I'm making up for lost time by taking more vitamin E.
Yeah, vitamin E is interesting because I have supplemented with vitamin E some. I definitely want to try some of yours. I'll probably order some of that soon. Um, but it's cool because vitamin E is another nutrient that we don't get enough of now, but we used to get a lot of a long time ago, when we were eating more wild foods. Like wild nuts and things like that, like acorns, hickory nuts, pecans, hazelnuts, um, sunflower seeds. Obviously, I think a lot of vitamin. Is your stuff derived from sunflower seeds?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So all of these wild nuts that people used to consume in much larger quantities than we consume today, while they did have some PUFAs in them, they also had monounsaturated fats, which we know are the beneficial, some of the beneficial fats in olive oil and things like that. While these nuts did have some polyunsaturated fats, they also did have some saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and vitamin E in varying concentrations depending on what the nut was, the growing conditions that year, and all those types of things. I don't have any numbers on it, but I do know that most the seeds of most edible wild plants contain varying higher levels of vitamin E. So we don't. Most people don't really eat a whole lot of fresh nuts anymore. We eat like shelled almonds that have been like roasted and like in a plastic bag on the Whole Foods shelf for 8 months and fried in peanut oil. Um, it is possible to, if you're not willing to supplement with vitamin E, to like just buy some fresh nuts. Like just eat some fresh nuts. Like if you want to roast them yourself. But don't buy these rancid, pre-processed, um, shelf-stable nuts that have essentially had all of the anti-inflammatory or at least inflammatory balancing compounds removed from them in the process of rendering them shelf stable.
That's
I really
awesome.
like
Yeah,
to.
that's great.
What I do is
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll take I'll take either pecans or hickory nuts if it's a good year for hickory nuts. Unfortunately, this year was not a good year for them, and because what a lot of people don't know is pecans are actually a hickory nut. So if you're buying pecans at the store, um, they are obviously like varieties of they're horticulturally bred varieties of pecans that are larger and things, but they're still very close to their wild progenitors. What I'll do is I like to take pecans and I'll blend them up. I'll take, I don't know, a cup or cup and a half. And I'll blend them up with some water, maple syrup, a little bit of salt, maybe some vanilla bean or a little bit of cacao or something, and then I'll pour that. I blend it up till it's nice and smooth. And I'll pour that into a pot and I'll cook it for, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes. And what that does is it sort of it cooks some of the fibers in the nut and sort of breaks them down and makes them a little bit more digestible. And it gives it this like kind of this like more viscous sort of quality. And it also opens up and brings out a lot of the fats and the vitamin E and all that kind of good lipid based nutrition that's in the nuts. And then I mix it up, I'll blend it, and then I'll just pour it through a strainer just in case there's any like chunks of anything in there and get it out, make it nice and smooth. And that's just like a really good, wholesome milk. It's pecan milk. There's a company, I think they're out of Texas now, that sells it, but to me it's really weak. You can make it yourself for like half the cost and twice as strong, and it's fresher. It's not like sitting on a shelf, because that's the biggest thing with nuts is you want to get them whole, even preferably in the shell if you can, because that shell actually protects the fats inside the nuts from oxidizing and going rancid, and vitamin E from becoming inert. So you can buy a lot of nuts in the shell still. You can do the same thing that I just described with pecans. You can also do it with hazelnuts as well. Same process. You can buy hazelnuts still in the shell, pecans in the shell. You can buy almonds in the shell, but I don't like almonds. I think they're gross. I just never liked them for some reason. Um, there's other different kinds of nuts. You can do it with walnuts. Are kind of tricky because a lot of walnuts, organic walnuts, are hard to find, and like they're like always rancid, and you can't really get walnuts in the shell. And the walnuts in the shell are like the shells are always so hard to crack. So I just like avoid walnuts altogether because I don't really like them that much. But pecans for me are like my staple nut. Are you much of a nut guy, or do you try to avoid those for the most part?
That was really interesting. Yeah, I avoid them for the most part, but that might be because in my raw vegan days, I was blowing through bags of pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds like almost every day. But
Oh yeah,
I like pine nuts a lot. Those are probably my favorite. For some reason, my body just craves those things.
yeah. I do like pine nuts as well. Those are an interesting thing. They've been a staple food for lots of different cultures all over the world for pretty much forever. I don't know about Idaho, but some of the other western states, like they have the pine nut, I think it's the pinyon pine, that you can harvest your own pine nuts from because they have large, they have the large nuts in them. Yeah, I really love pine nuts. You have to be careful with pine nuts too, though, because you have to make sure they're fresh. Because a lot of pine nuts come from China and they're rancid by the time they make it here. Costco actually has pine nuts. I think they're imported, but they're usually pretty fresh. We buy them all the time, and my daughter will just eat them like candy. She goes crazy for them. They have a pretty good
That,
balance of of different fats in them. So yeah, there's some PUFA in there, but as long as it's in its whole form and it's not sitting in a bottle for who knows how long, I really don't see a little bit of PUFA in the form of nuts when it's balanced with eating a diet rich in saturated fats and all that stuff. I think it all balances itself out when you're trying to avoid the larger sources, the vegetable oils and things like that. I think the trace amounts that you get elsewhere are not really anything to worry about, in my opinion.
yeah, I fully agree. And kind of a random question for you. I've heard that people have found deer antler around where I am, like on the trails or off the trails when they shed them. And have you hunted for deer antler where you are? Or have you ever found it in the wild?
Yeah, so the stuff that you're gonna find that the like deer are scratching off, like there's probably gonna be some, usable properties in that stuff. If you find it, if it's real fresh. I've actually not personally myself, but a friend of mine has harvested deer antler off of roadkill before. So that's really cool because you can get it like while it's still fresh on the animal, and the antlers are like they're like gel. It's like jelly. They're like real soft, and there's like some like they're like bloody, and that stuff when you get it fresh like that and you tincture that fresh, I mean that's just like the cream of the crop of deer antler goes. A lot of the companies, what they do is they get the deer antler and they freeze dry it. I think is what they do, or they dehydrate it in some fashion, and then they powder it up and they put it in capsules. Now that stuff's fine, it's good, it's nutritive, but when you get that fresh stuff, the hormonal qualities of it is like they're much higher than um, the commercial stuff. That's not to in any way discredit any of the commercial stuff because it's all really good. But when you can get it fresh like that, just like anything else, you fresh fresh milk, fresh meat, anything, it's always going to be better. So if you can get like a fresh, some fresh deer antler off of of a deer that was still alive, it's really good stuff. Recommend it, but don't go too crazy on it though, because it can be pretty strong. I find.
Yeah, it's kind of like pine pollen, right? It's pretty close to bioidentical kind of hormone therapy.
Pine pollen's interesting because I like pine pollen more as like a nutritive food. Like I like to cook with pine pollen. Like I mix pine pollen in, like if I make like pancakes or something. Like I'll put a little pine pollen in there. The hormonal aspects of pine pollen really come out when you tincture it in alcohol. That tends to draw out more of the testosterones and the androgens and things like that. Whereas when you cook it, it sort of, I don't want to say it doesn't completely neutralize those effects, but it definitely makes them a little bit more balanced, I find. And then sort of the more nutritive, like vitamin and mineral aspects of the pine pollen are sort of more there when you eat it as a food rather than taking it as a supplement.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love putting that and colostrum in my pancakes. It's so delicious with a lot of maple syrup, of course.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And some blueberries, can't beat it.
I wanted to ask you about usnea. I
Are you
messaged you. I think it was on it. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say something about blueberries, but yeah, we can talk about usnea if that's what you were saying. I think that's what you said.
Yeah, I was just curious how to use it. Like, can you put that in an alcohol and tincture it? From what I was reading online, usnea, this mossy like material, is mostly for topical use, right? Like antiseptic.
Yeah, it can be used as an antiseptic. You can take it internally. It's a good antiviral, general antimicrobial. Um, the, I don't really have much experience using it other than an alcohol tincture because I never find much of it that I want to use it for anything other than alcohol because you just get more mileage out of your herbs when you alcohol extract them, but you also do miss out on some of the compounds that are more water soluble. I think with usnea, it's generally taken either as a tea or as a tincture. Um, it's not something I have like a. It's like one of those herbs where it's like it's said to be powerful, and I think it's powerful, but it's not like one of those things that you feel. It's like you take reishi mushroom and you feel it. You take usnea, and it's just one of those things where it's like you've read that it's antiviral, and you take it, and your cold sort of goes away, and it sort of supports like everything else that you're doing to get the cold to go away. The usnea just seems to sort of support the whole process of like getting over the virus or the whatever pathogen it is that you're experiencing that's making you sick.
Awesome. That's really interesting. I'll have to try it. And you asked me about blueberries. Yeah, I consume them. It's just hard to find fresh. And so I found like flash frozen, like fresh blueberries up here. Um, and they just get kind of like soggy, because all the water goes in. And so if I can find like really fresh, I like them not unripe, but I just like them firm. And yeah, I think that's an awesome staple sugar source is blueberries.
Yeah, you can get huckleberries up there too, which is in the same. They're a related species to blueberries, but they since they grow at a higher altitude, they just have much more higher levels of nutrition. Um, the huckleberries are great. It's funny. I do like fresh blueberries, but I also really like frozen blueberries. So I'll tell you the blueberries that I buy when I buy blueberries. Trader Joe's, man, they have the best deal on blueberries. It's like one of the very few things that I buy at like a commercial grocery store. They have wild boreal blueberries. They're grown in like Canada, I think Quebec or something like that. It's like they're like $3 for a bag. I researched the source. It's like really clean. They don't use any chemicals. Um, I think they're organic. I can't remember, but they seem to be the most. Now they're obviously grown. I think they're like cultivated, but they're the same species as the wild lowbush blueberries. So like if you think about like the quintessential like Maine blueberry, like the real small little like BB sized blueberries, they're really similar to that. And I found that those are like the closest thing I can get to a wild blueberry when I don't have any wild blueberries, and I really love those things. Great in pancakes. That's what the best thing to do with the frozen blueberries for me is either put them in like a smoothie or put them in like a baked good, because then it's like that. You still get the blueberry taste and the blueberry experience, but it doesn't have that like weird mushy thing that you get when you just eat them like when they thawed out.
Oh, I'm definitely going to try that. Yeah, I thought about making it into jam too, because I've been getting, I think it was Josh Rubin kind of influenced me. He does gluten-free toast, for breakfast a lot. And I've been getting back into that, with a jam spread, different jams, and it's really delicious.
Oh yeah, jams are a really good way to get your fruit in. Um, the interesting thing about blueberries and just the Vaccinium genus in general, which includes blueberries, lingonberries, cranberry, um, what else? The huckleberry is also in the Vaccinium genus. All those berries have a lot of really interesting properties, like the pectins are, I believe, they bind to heavy metals in the digestive system, and then also they have like the pigments, the antioxidant qualities, and then they also have, especially cranberries, have anti-adhesion compounds. Arthur Haynes actually taught me about this. One time I stayed at his house a few years ago, and we made this whole cranberry juice, and he makes it for the anti-adhesion compounds that help like kind of keep the the UTI infections under wraps if you manage to get one. It's also good for men's health with the prostate and all that, the pipes down there. They have these compounds that essentially keep unwanted material, bacteria, things like that, from sticking to the inside walls of all parts of your body. But the cranberries specifically have an affinity for that lower part of the body. And that's something I do almost every year in the wintertime. I'll make like a big batch of cranberries. What I do is I basically just take like, I get a couple bags of just regular old organic cranberries from the grocery store, um, and I put them in a pot, and I cover them with water, and I cook them, and they start to pop. And once they all pop, then I'll take them out, and I'll put them I'll strain it, and I'll mash them all up, and then I'll add the water back in, and then I pour that through a strainer and kind of mix it through, and it gets the skins off, but it sort of pulls a lot of the compounds out of the skins, and then you get the pectin. And then I add some maple syrup in there, and I mix it all up, and then I put it in jars while it's still like boiling hot, and I'll can it, and I'll just put it in the refrigerator, and I just pull it out and drink it, every once in a while. Um, every couple of weeks, I'll just pull it out and maybe have like a quart or two every couple of weeks, just to kind of keep the urinary tract health sort of on point. But any of those berries, the blueberries, all those berries have really good, medicinal properties beyond just like tasting really awesome and being really fun to eat.
That sounds really good. I'm gonna have to try that. I wanted to jump into wild rice because we kind of scratched the surface in our first chat on the podcast, and so I eat your product from Wild Food Warehouse. I order it in bulk, as you know, and that'll be my dinner or part of my dinner, maybe 4 or 5 nights out of the week on average. Like I had leftovers of it last night, and a little goes a long way. I'll usually have leftovers where I have to store it in a Pyrex in the fridge for the next day, which is awesome because that's half the meal done. And I would say 90% of my meals, like my fallback meal, my default, is just ground meat, whether it be elk, bison, beef, venison, and then mixed with your rice. And then whatever else condiments I want, maybe some harissa, Moroccan red pepper sauce. And it's just a really easy dinner. And it's just an awesome carbohydrate source. I feel like if a lot of the carnivore people were just to add in your product, your rice, they'd see huge results, because they're supporting their liver health and consequently their thyroid.
Yeah, I mean, wild rice is one of those things that was just like a massive game changer for me. I mean, that phrase has been co-opted by the vegan agenda now, but um, when I discovered wild rice, because I had it before, like the Whole Foods grade wild rice, which is like not really wild rice, but I had that stuff, and I wanted to like it because I just started to get into wild foods, and I was just like, yeah, this is okay, I guess. I'd rather just eat white rice if this is what wild rice is. So I finally found like the real stuff, and when I found it, I was like, I need to build a business off of this because like people need to like have this stuff. Like I don't care how much money I make off of it. Like it's not about the money. It's about people getting this like and having it as a staple. So like I've managed to find a good um, source of it. It's all harvested by native harvesters in Minnesota, and they're paid well, and they end up with enough for their families and enough to support the people that want to enjoy it as well. So I really like it because it sort of breaks a lot of myths, and I'm like a myth buster. I love to bust all the myths that people have about like hunter gatherers and like ancient people. Um, it just busts a lot of myths. People have been eating wild rice for at least 8 or 9 thousand years, if not more. Um, and it's a grain. It's a wild grain. We're always taught that like grains are like so scarce, and if they're in the wild, they're almost not, harvestable in any significant quantity. But wild rice is one of those things that sort of just proves that wrong. Um, if anybody wants to look at my Instagram um, for my business, Wild Food Warehouse, I put a post up there a couple weeks ago to show the just the vast abundance that is the wild rice beds. You know, in the area that I harvest in myself, it's just a really awesome place. The water's very clean, and there's enough rice there for like dozens or more people to harvest every year sustainably. If you move to other areas like in Minnesota, there's just thousands of acres, thousands of lakes that have wild rice that people could be harvesting it, and they do. But you know, it's one of those things that it seems inaccessible to people because we've been taught to believe that grains are something that we need all this like high tech machinery to harvest, and that since that's the case, then we shouldn't eat it. Which I agree with to some level, but I also think that um, grains are one of those foods that can be very beneficial to us in times when other foods aren't as available. Wild rice, not only does it taste good, it has a lot of nutrition. On my website, I've got a chart that just kind of compares the various nutrient levels of um, grass-fed beef to wild rice. Now, a lot of people take it the wrong way, and they think that I'm trying to like assert that wild rice has the same nutrient profile as grass-fed beef, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to illustrate that beef is seen as this like nutritional powerhouse, which it is, but it's just to illustrate that not all grains are bad, and that there are some grains that actually are beneficial to us and can support our health, not destroy it, like has been painted by the paleo and the carnivore community. Now, that doesn't mean I think that people should go out and start buying Wonder Bread, but that does mean that I think that people could benefit, especially the people that have decided to completely go off of plants. They could certainly benefit from adding just a little bit of something like wild rice into their diet. Even if it's just a couple of times a week to cycle in some carbohydrates. I think that a lot of people would get, some noticeable performance gains in their life. Be it working or exercise or sports or whatever. I just think it's a really awesome food that more people should try. And I'm certainly not the only source for it, but I spent a lot of time finding a source that was really high integrity, where the producers of the product were getting paid well, and making sure that it's coming from an area that's far away from any kind of agricultural contamination that's so popular in a lot of the areas where wild rice grows. One of the cool things about it, though, is that it won't really grow in water that's contaminated. So if you find wild rice growing in a lake, you can pretty much be assured that it's going to be safe to consume. There's obviously going to be exceptions to that rule, but overall, um, anything that's like going to be 100% real wild rice, you're gonna be it's going to be pretty safe. Um, for those of you that don't actually know what wild rice is it's a plant that grows like regular rice. It grows in water, so it does require water to grow. It's not something anybody can try to grow, but there is certainly options for people if they want to order seeds. There's various people that sell it in season. It has to be purchased wet and transported wet and then planted immediately into whatever body of water that it's going to be growing in, and it does require a pretty significant seeding rate in order to establish harvestable stands. The cool thing about it for you, though, Matt, is there's some places in Idaho. I don't know where they are. I've just heard about them where duck hunters have planted wild rice over the years. And there is actually people that go out and harvest wild rice in Idaho, even though it's not native to the area. Since the plantings have been done, that you can actually go out and find it yourself. So that might be something you want to look for in the next year. The season is like runs from the end of August till the end of September, depending on where you are. And it's one of those things where it's like it's just one season every year, and whatever gets harvested is what you have for the year, and then you have to wait for next year to get more. So the supplies are always somewhat limited. So it's good to stock up earlier in the year, or rather than later, because sometimes at the end of the year, or I'm sorry, the end of the summer, the supply starts to get kind of low. So right now is rice season, if you will.
That's really fascinating. And is how much could I gather in like an hour? Like, is it because I think I've seen videos of people harvesting and processing wild rice into a food. Is it something you need like a canoe for, or can you just get like wading boots and kind of like walk out in the shallow water?
Yeah, that would be interesting. It's probably possible, but I would say you definitely need a canoe. You need a canoe. You need the rice knockers, which are like two long sticks that are about, I don't know, 28 to 38 inches long. And then if you go on my Instagram, if anybody wants to, they can go and see I have videos of me harvesting and processing the rice on my personal Instagram page. Um, you can get about 100 pounds a day at the lake that I go to. Now, some of the other lakes further north, like in Minnesota, where the rice that I actually sell is coming from, those guys are getting like between 3 and 4 and 500 pounds a day. Now, those are people that are very experienced at ricing. I've only been doing it for 3 years, so um, I am not that efficient. This year, I ended up with about 100 pounds. So for every pound of rice that you harvest, once that rice is processed and ready to eat, you're only going to end up with about half the weight. So if you harvest 10 pounds, you're going to end up with about 4 to 5 pounds of finished rice that you can actually eat. It depends on a couple of things. The weight of the rice when you harvest it. So, like, say if it rains that day, the rice is going to be a little bit heavier. If it's dried out, it's going to be a little bit lighter. So you might end up with a little bit better of a yield if the rice is a little bit drier when you harvest it. Different weather conditions can also affect the size of the kernels of the grains of rice inside the husks. So that can obviously affect your yield too. Um, it's a lengthy process, but it's one of those things where I can go, or anyone can go with the right instruction and harvest enough rice to eat a couple of times a week, a family of four or five, a couple of times a week for a whole year. And harvest all of that and process that all within like the inside of like a 40-hour work week or something. So you can end up with a staple food in a week of regular American elbow grease type work. So it's one of those things where it's 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 really amazing for me that I have the opportunity to go do that every year. And um, just the value that provides me is like there's no price on that.
That's incredible. I love it. And one thing I think I missed in the last episode was cooking time of your wild rice, because I think I've seen videos. I forget if it was Arthur Haynes or someone else in that community, and it was about soaking the wild rice. And you don't have to soak yours, right? You can just cook it right out of the bag.
Yeah. So the thing about wild rice is when it's processed, it gets heated. So the reason why they do this is because when the rice, they call it parching. So they have these like giant, like at an industrial scale. So all the rice is getting harvested by hand. But at an industrial scale, they have these large, like pans, for lack of a better term, where they pour the rice on, and then they have these big fires going with wood. I think they usually use cedar or birch wood to parch the rice. So that what they do is they pour um, all this rice onto these big pots, and they stir it around, and it heats it up. And what that does is it shrinks the kernel. It makes it smaller inside of the husk, so that when they what's called treading, when they tread the rice and essentially cause the kernel to separate from the husk, the kernel doesn't break. So that heat sort of shrinks and hardens the kernel of the rice inside the husk, and then the husk is easier to take off. When that heating occurs, two things happen. Some of the phytic acid is taken care of by the heat, and but the enzymes that cause the rice to sprout are destroyed. So when you are soaking wild rice, the rice isn't gonna it's not gonna lose any phytic acid, but you don't really have to worry about that because the heat took care of some of the phytic acid. And then in the process of removing the husk, also what happens is some of the bran, which is where the phytic acid also sits or rests or lives, is removed. So you really don't have to worry about soaking wild rice the way you soak other grains because it's not going to do the same thing. What soaking wild rice does is it essentially helps the rice cook faster because it like pre-absorbs some of the water, and then when you cook it, you don't have to cook it as long. So on my package, I recommend using 1 cup of rice to 3 cups of water. Now, there's a couple things to consider. If you have really hard water, you should probably be using a filter like Matt recommends. But if you're not using a filter, then you need to use a little bit more water than you normally would because the rice just doesn't seem to cook as well when the water has more minerals in it. If you're using a really clean, like a really low TDS spring water or like a reverse osmosis or a distilled water, you want to use just a little bit less. So if you're going to soak it beforehand, maybe use like 2 to 2.5 cups of water instead of the full 3, and then you can kind of like add or subtract the water as it's cooking. And, you'll figure out what works best for you. It just really kind of depends on the water that you're using about how long you need to cook it and how much you need to cook it. I really like to soak it for like say if I'm gonna go away for the day, I'll put the rice out in the morning, let it soak for like 8 hours. I take it home, I put it on the pot, I let it cook 10, 15, 20 minutes, it's done. It just depends on how much water I used, how clean the water was, and how long I let it soak. Um, if you're but you're you're not obligated in any way to soak it. You can just take it out of the package, 3-to-1 ratio, 45 minutes, and it's done. I recommend adding all of your spices and your salt and your butter and your fat, and pork fat and your bacon and all that stuff that you want to spice and mix with the rice to make it taste better, to flavor it. I recommend adding all that stuff at the end when it's already pretty much done cooking and all the water is absorbed and evaporated from the rice. Then add all your spices and stuff. It just tastes a lot better that way. Another thing that's really good to add to the rice is maple syrup. Really, just the two things just really complement each other really well. And that was kind of the traditional way it was eaten, was with maple sugar, maple syrup, or even cooked in maple water. I've done that before, where you just cook the rice in the fresh sap in the spring of the maple trees. It's just a really great versatile food. You can make things like risottos out of it. You can eat it for breakfast. I really like to cook it. Like if I have some left over from the night before, what I'll do is I'll take it, I'll put some into another pot. I'll add like some blueberries, maybe a little bit of the pecan milk that I mentioned earlier, and I'll just kind of like cook that all down, and then I'll eat it with like, maybe some bison breakfast sausage or some pork sausage or some bacon or maybe a little bit of like slow cooked venison. Maybe add a little bit more butter in there or some more maple syrup or just kind of something to give it a little bit of a nice sweet breakfast taste to it. It's just a really good way to start the day. And a meal like that will last you most of the day. If you eat a nice big helping of that, it'll sort of keep you feeling pretty good most of the day.
Wow, those are great ideas. I'm definitely going to try some of that. Last question before we wrap up here. I had duck nachos the other day, and they blew me away. And I think I've had duck fat, in different dishes. And I was just wondering if you have experience with duck or if you've researched the nutrition of it. I would imagine it's more nutritious than chicken, right?
Yeah, it's not something I've researched much. I do like duck fat. I mean, it's really good. It's one of those things where like I only like it to cook stuff in. Like I really like potatoes fried in duck fat or like carrots cooked in duck fat. It's not like something I really want to eat. Like, oh, I don't want to really cook a steak or a piece of fish in duck fat, but it's really good to cook vegetables with. I don't really know much about the nutrition aspect of it, but I imagine, if you're getting it from like a pastured source, these ducks are going to be eating some really, really good things. So I think it's probably a really good balanced source of, animal fat. It's going to have like probably a pretty good profile of fat soluble vitamins and things like that. Aside from that, I don't really know a whole lot about it other than it does taste really good with potatoes. And it's good with wild rice too. I will say I've mixed it in with wild rice before, and it's pretty good. Duck and wild rice also go really well together. I've never experienced this, but they say that the best ducks are the ones that eat wild rice. But I haven't tried it yet.
Interesting. Wow, that's super cool. Yeah, here it's kind of has like a Portland vibe as far as the hipster places to eat. So I've been having a lot of fun checking out the local spots, and a lot of them source from relatively local areas, not from overseas. So it's really, really cool. Right on, Ben. Well, yeah, this was awesome. I could see us having another discussion in the future, especially as I get deeper into foraging and stuff. I'm sure I'll have another arena of questions for you.
Excellent. Would love to be back.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll put all the links below to Ben's personal Instagram, his business Instagram, the website, and then the Fireweed too. I'll put the link for that where you can buy that because that sounds pretty cool.
Awesome, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Ben. Stick around and I'm going to close out the show. Well, that wraps up today's show. I loved that part on the willow tree and that wild animals used to consume the willow tree, and now we're eating domesticated animals that don't consume that plant, so they're actually deficient in these aspirin compounds. So in that sense, aspirin is more of a supplement than a pharmaceutical drug. Really interesting discussion, and I'd like to see that go further in other circles in this community, because I think it's overlooked, and I think aspirin is one of the solutions to PUFA poisoning, and I utilize it often when I consume questionable meals outside of the home that probably contain canola oil or some other toxic vegetable oil. So I'll often consume aspirin in combination with my PUFA Protect product, the vitamin E, and that's like complete coverage against all damage that polyunsaturated fatty acids would cause to destroy the cell and the mechanisms of the cell to generate energy. So really cool stuff. Also love that he's a fan of starch. He's really going against the grain here because it's really popular right now to talk about anti-nutrients and plants are bad. And Ben actually sells truly wild rice that's one, a plant, and two, a grain. And a lot of people, especially in the carnivore community, think that's horrible. That's the worst thing you could put in your body. But on his website, he actually has a blog where he breaks down the nutrition of wild rice and its use traditionally in native diets in North America. And just fascinating information. I feel amazing on it. Like I said in the interview, it's a staple of my diet. And hopefully, like you said, I can find some up here in Idaho. That would be really cool to forage some of my own wild rice. It sounds like a fun little day trip. And it's always nice to gather your food and medicine out in your environment. There's something that happens. I used to do that with acorns and nettle root. And it's just a different feeling when you consume it, to know that you were a part of the entire process of the gathering, of the processing, and of the consumption. All of it was you, which kind of changes, I believe, how it's absorbed in the body. So definitely inspired to dive deeper into foraging the more I talk to Ben and just learn about the flora and fauna in my local ecosystem here, because I'm in the right spot. There's tons of birch trees, there's tons of wild animals, there's tons of medicinal mushrooms, especially the birch polypore here, and usnea, as I mentioned in the show. Just so many species to identify. I really like Ben's suggestion when he said, find a pro, an expert, and go out in the field with them. And that's going to be more fun, and you're with an expert, so they'll be able to fast track you with learning the local plants and or getting a book of local plants and how to identify them and describing them. Really awesome practical tips there. So I'll put the link to his website below, Wild Food Warehouse, and his Instagram. And definitely try out the wild rice. That combined with like ground bison or ground grass-fed beef, a little bit of butter, a little bit of Icelandic sea salt or a pure sea salt, and you have a really delicious meal. I've also been into this Moroccan red pepper sauce called harissa, and it's really delicious. They make a mild and a spicy, and that I could eat every day. It's really, really delicious and a really quick meal. So if you're on the go, you're really busy, I'm always doing stuff, I need kind of quick meals, that's a really great, nutritious powerhouse right there. So Wild Food Warehouse, if you use the code Blackburn, you save 10%. I recommend just going for the 5-pound bag or buying multiple of those. And it goes a long way. And as long as it's stored properly, it will last pretty much forever. And as always, if you want to support my work, you can go to matt-blackburn.com, where I have all my recommended products listed there. I update them frequently, and they all have discount codes. And then my personal brand is Mitolife, and that can be found at mitolife.co. I have 5 products currently and constantly growing. I'm always thinking of new products, have a couple of cool ideas. But right now it's 3 enzymes, Shilajit tablets, and vitamin E. So those are very powerful products, especially the systemic enzymes, the Shilajit and the vitamin E. Getting a lot of amazing testimonials on those. The digestive enzymes and the gluten enzymes as well. I look at those as more of a help if you're recovering from stress, because digestive enzyme secretion lowers during stress or after prolonged stress. So all of my products help to reduce stress. You reduce the fibrosis, stress goes down. You take vitamin E, stress goes down. You supplement 84 plus carbon bonded organic trace mineral, stress goes down. So there's a lot of factors to health, but I like to work at the most fundamental level. And that's really with vitamins, minerals, and enzymes. And those all work together in tandem in a really intricate way. So I hope you guys are digging this kind of information of foraging, hunting, kind of connecting with your environment, because I think it's missing in the health world. We go to the health food store, we go home, and we make these different recipes. But how many of us are actually going out into the wild and foraging, properly identifying, safely identifying, and then processing that food and medicine into edible products? Not many of us. And so I want to see that happen more, especially if you have birch trees around you. Usually you're going to find some chaga mushroom, which is so versatile. As Ben said, you can use it as a ember carrier, which is really incredible. Today's quote is by Albert E. Jenkins, 1900. Wild rice and the Ojibwe people. Wild rice is the most nutritive single food which the Indians of North America consume. The Indian diet of this grain, combined with maple sugar and with bison, deer, and other meats, was probably richer than that of average American family of today.